I thought the meeting was routine. I even joked to myself in the elevator. I said, "Another long day." I said, "You're safe here." I believed effort protected me. I believed loyalty counted. I believed love stayed. I was wrong. Ryan texted, "Conference room." "No." I grabbed my notebook and walked in calm. Ryan didn't look at me. The HR woman smiled tight. Emily sat there too. I asked, "Why is Emily here?" Ryan said, "Sit down." Emily crossed her arms. "Just sit." I sat. My throat felt dry. HR said, "We've reviewed the reports." I said, "Who filed them?" Ryan said, "That's confidential." I said, "So you won't say my accuser?" HR said, "Please stay calm." I said, "I am calm." Ryan said, "You never are." I said, "You stole my access." Ryan said, "Prove it." I said, "Check the logs." HR said, "We did." I said, "Then you saw the breach." Ryan said, "Enough deflection." Emily said, "Just answer them." I said, "I am answering." HR said, "Lower your voice." I said, "I'm losing my job." Ryan said, "By your actions." I said, "By your setup." Ryan smiled. I said, "You planned this." Ryan said, "You planned your own failure." Emily said, "Stop fighting." I said, "You're part of this." She didn't respond. HR said, "This meeting is over." Ryan slid a folder. "Expense fraud." I laughed. "That's a joke." Emily said, "Stop." I opened the folder. Numbers I didn't recognize stared back. I said, "Those aren't mine." Ryan leaned back. "They came from your login." I said, "That's impossible." Emily looked away. I asked her, "Emily, tell them." She said, "I can't." I whispered, "Why?" Ryan said, "Because it's true." HR said, "We're terminating your contract." I stood. "You didn't even ask me." Ryan said, "Security will walk you out." I looked at Emily. "You know me." She said, "I know what I saw." I said, "You saw nothing." Ryan smiled. "Enough." 2 guards appeared. One said, "Sir, please." I said, "Don't touch me." Ryan said, "They will." I said, "You enjoyed this." Ryan said, "I earned this." I said, "You cheated." Ryan said, "I adapted." I said, "You betrayed blood." Ryan said, "Blood never helped me." I said, "I did." Ryan said, "Not enough." I said, "You're empty." Ryan said, "I'm winning." I said, "Not forever." Ryan laughed. I said, "Ryan, this is sick." They took my badge. I said, "Emily, please." She said, "I'm sorry." The doors closed behind me. I said, "You'll regret this." Ryan said, "Doubt it." Outside, my phone buzzed. Emily texted, "We need to talk tonight." I replied, "You already talked." Hours later, rain soaked the street. Emily opened the apartment door. She said, "You look awful." I said, "You look relieved." She said, "That's not fair." I said, "Nothing tonight is fair." She said, "Lower your voice." I said, "Why?" She said, "Neighbors." I said, "You worried about them?" She said, "I'm worried about me." I nodded. I said, "That explains everything." I said, "You framed me." She sighed. Ryan showed me proof. I said, "Fake proof." She said, "You always doubt him." I said, "Because he hates me." She said, "He's my future." My chest tightened. I asked, "How long?" She said, "Long enough." I laughed. "So I'm homeless too." She said, "You'll manage." I said, "After 3 years?" She said, "Don't make this harder." I grabbed my bag. I said, "Tell me the truth." She said, "This is the truth." I said, "Look at me." She said, "Don't." I said, "Was it worth it?" She said, "I chose stability." I said, You chose him. She said, he understands ambition. I said, I understood you. She said, not enough. I said, say his name. She said, Ryan. I felt sick. She said, I'm not apologizing. I said, you already did worse. She said, you'll survive. I said, you won't sleep. She laughed, then stopped. She said, just go. She stepped aside. She said, you can't stay. I said, I know. Ryan texted her. She smiled. I stepped into the rain. I said, breathe. I said, don't scream. I said, keep moving. Cars passed. I said, 3 years. I said, late nights. I said, promises. I said, all gone. My phone vibrated again. I said, not now. I checked. Nothing. I said, of course. I walked until my legs shook. I sat on a bus bench. A man next to me asked, you okay? I said, no. I called my mother. It rang. I said, please. Voicemail. I checked my phone. My hands shook. I said, just one call. Nothing loaded. I said, I'm alone. I said out loud, this is it. I waited. No one answered. I said, I gave everything. Rain kept falling. I said, I was loyal. Traffic hummed. I said, I was honest. The city didn't care. I said, I tried. No one answered. No calls. No messages. I had nothing left, and nowhere left that felt like mine. That truth finally sank in. I woke under the bridge and said my name aloud. No one answered, so I said it again softer. My stomach growled and I whispered, calm down please. A woman passed and looked through me like glass. I said excuse me and she never slowed down. I laughed and told myself welcome to invisible life. I walked toward the shelter sign and stopped myself. I said you smell bad, do not embarrass yourself. Hunger argued back saying pride never fed anyone. I said fine you win and kept walking anyway. Inside the shelter a guard said full today. I said okay and meant nothing by it. Outside I kicked a can and apologized to it. I said sorry world, I am failing quietly. A voice nearby said talking helps sometimes kid. I turned and saw a man with tired eyes. He said name is Sam, you look freshly broken. I said I am just resting between bad decisions. Sam laughed and said that is everyone here. I said do you always joke like that? He said only when pain gets too loud. I sat beside him and shared my silence. Sam said hunger makes memories sharper, watch out. I said memories already hurt plenty thanks. He said then talk them smaller before they eat. I said my girlfriend chose my stepbrother. Sam said betrayal tastes worse than cold soup. I said maybe I earned it somehow. Sam said careful shame lies with confidence. I said I trusted them like family. Sam said family breaks people more efficiently. I asked how long he lived outside. He said long enough to forgive sidewalks. I smiled and said you are strange. He said you are still judging yourself harder. I said I lost everything in one night. Sam said nights like that charge interest. I said maybe I was weak. Sam said weakness is believing liars loved you. I stared at my hands and said maybe. Sam said tell me about someone good. I said my grandfather Arthur believed in me. Sam said belief without price is rare. I said he never raised his voice. Sam said quiet men hide oceans inside. I said he gave me rules not lectures. Sam said that is love pretending discipline. I said he told me never beg. Sam said yet here we are breathing anyway. I said he trusted me when I failed. Sam said then trust yourself once more. I said I do not know how. Sam said start by eating when possible. I laughed and said fair advice teacher. Sam said call me when rich later. I said if that happens I will. A bus passed and sprayed water near us. I said great, even buses dislike me. Sam said they splash, everyone equally relax. I checked my bag and felt old metal. Sam said what is that face about? I said, nothing, just junk from childhood. Sam said, junk survives when plans fail. I pulled the card out and frowned. I said, my grandpa said, never throw this. Sam said, then do not argue with ghosts. I held it tighter and felt strangely steadier. I said, maybe this still matters somehow. I pulled the card from my bag and stared at it again. It felt heavier than yesterday. I said, you better not be useless. I walked until the rain bullied me into a glass building with no sign. A guard stepped in front of me. He said, sir, this is private. I said, I just need to stand inside. He said, do you have an appointment? I shook my head and said, no. He said, then you need to leave. I felt stupid and angry at the same time. I said, please, 5 minutes. He looked at my shoes. He said, you're soaked. I said, so is the floor. He sighed and said, name. I gave it. He typed and frowned. He said, nothing here. I nodded and reached for the door. The card slid from my fingers and hit the desk. He said, what's that? I said, trash. He picked it up. He stopped breathing for a second. He said, where did you get this? I said, my grandfather. He straightened and said, wait here. He walked fast. I stood dripping and confused. I said to myself, don't hope. A woman appeared and said, I'm Ms. Lou. I said, I'm sorry for the mess. She said, follow me. I said, am I in trouble? She said, no. I followed her past offices that smelled expensive. A man rushed toward us. He said, is it him? Ms. Lou said, yes. The man grabbed my hand. He said, I'm Caldwell. I said, okay. He said, your grandfather saved this firm. I said, he fixed watches. Caldwell laughed and said, he owned silence. I didn't understand. Ms. Lou said, please sit. I sat in a leather chair that felt unreal. Caldwell said, the card authorizes control. I said, control of what? Ms. Lou said, everything he left. I laughed and said, he left nothing. Caldwell said, he left patience. I said, this feels wrong. Ms. Lou said, it is legal. I said, I didn't earn it. Caldwell said, you survived him. My hands shook. I said, why me? Ms. Lou said, because he trusted you. I swallowed and said, I'm not ready. Caldwell said, neither was he. Silence pressed in. I looked at the city through the glass. I said, I still feel empty. Ms. Lou said, money doesn't heal. Caldwell said, but it opens doors. I nodded slowly. They left me alone. I sat there shaking. I said aloud, breathe. The chair creaked. I said, Grandpa, what did you do? My phone buzzed and scared me. It was a number I didn't know. I answered and said, hello. Ms. Lou said, apologies, one more thing. I said, yes. She said, we need your signature. I said, for what exactly? She said, activation. I laughed once and stopped. I said, that sounds dangerous. She said, only to the unprepared. I said, I was homeless this morning. She said, I know. I blinked and said, you checked. She said, we check everything. I said, then you know I'm a mess. She said, messy people change systems. I didn't answer. Caldwell returned and said, he hated waste. I said, he hated lies more. Caldwell nodded. He said, so do we. I stared at the papers. I said, if I sign, what happens? Ms. Lou said, you become visible. I said, and my enemies? She said, they notice. I exhaled and said, I'm tired. Caldwell said, rest later. I picked up the pen. My hand shook again. I said, I wish he warned me. Ms. Lou said, he did. I said, how? She said, he gave you the card. I closed my eyes. I signed. The pen felt loud. Caldwell smiled softly. He said, welcome. I didn't smile back. I sat alone again. The office hummed. I felt powerful and broken at once. I whispered, "This changes everything." My voice shook. I said, "Okay." No one answered. I stared at the door. I said, "I'm not ready for this." The room stayed quiet. I pressed my palms together. I thought about the bridge. I said, "That feels far away." My stomach twisted. I said, "I don't feel rich." The walls didn't argue. I laughed quietly. I said, "Figures." I stood, then sat again. My legs trembled. I said, "Grandpa, I miss you." My chest tightened. I said, "I hope this was worth it." The glass reflected a stranger. I didn't recognize him. I touched the desk edge. It felt solid. I said, "Stay standing." My hands ignored me. I sat again. The chair held me. I breathed slowly. I said, "You asked for change." I said, "This is it." My pulse thudded. I felt the card warm in my pocket. I said, "Don't disappear." The office lights hummed again. I realized no one was coming to save me. I had already stepped through the door. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on the desk. I said, "Think." My thoughts raced. I said, "One step." I imagined Ryan's smile and pushed it away. I imagined Emily's voice and felt tired. I said, "Later." The desk phone blinked. I didn't answer it. I needed silence. I said, "You're allowed to pause." My breathing slowed. I counted to 10. I said, "Okay, Arthur." My throat tightened again. I remembered his hands fixing tiny gears. I said, "You planned this." The thought scared me. I wasn't sure I liked being planned for. I rubbed my face. I said, "Breathe again." The city moved outside without me. I felt small inside a big machine. I said, "Learn fast." My phone stayed quiet. I welcomed that. I wasn't ready to explain myself to anyone. I said, "Just sit." I listened to my heart. It beat hard and uneven. I said, "Still alive." That felt important. I adjusted the chair and faced the window. I promised myself not to run. I said, "Not tonight." My hands finally steadied a little. I nodded once. I waited. I stayed. I waited again. I sat still, shaking in the luxury office, knowing my life had shifted forever and my pain was still right there. I woke to the city buzzing far below and a luxury I didn't trust. I said, "Good morning, nightmare." The coffee machine hissed. I said, "At least someone's awake." I stared at the skyline. I said, "And I'm still empty." My phone buzzed. "Emily." I ignored it. I said, "Not today, not ever." The penthouse echoed with silence. I said, "Rich enough to hear ghosts." Ms. Liu's call came next. She said, "Good morning. Ready to review reports?" I said, "Always." She said, "Ryan's transactions are troubling." I said, "How bad?" She said, "More than you suspected. Some assets moved offshore." I said, "He didn't even try to hide it?" She said, "He did, but poorly." I laughed quietly. I said, "Poorly? That's comforting." She said, "You still want revenge?" I said, "Not yet. I want understanding." She said, "Wise, but patience is risky." I said, "I can live with that." I poured coffee. I said, "Hot enough to burn memories." Ms. Liu chuckled. She said, "Keep drinking. You need clarity." I said, "I already taste betrayal." She said, "Bitter is the first sip of truth." I said, "Then I drink slowly." I checked my accounts. I said, "Numbers that mean nothing to my heart." Ms. Liu said, "Power shows people, not feelings." I said, "I feel nothing yet everything." She said, "Welcome to adulthood." I said, "I thought that ended at 18. She laughed. A knock at the door. I said, "Not now." The assistant peeked in. She said, "Mr. Clark, a visitor?" I said, "Who?" She said, "Emily." I froze. I said, "Leave her waiting." She said, "As you wish." I breathed slow. I said, "I am not her joke anymore." Later, I sat with Ms. Liu in the office. I said, "How deep does Ryan go?" She said, "Contracts, shell companies, manipulated accounts." I said, "He risked prison." She said, "He already flinches under scrutiny." I said, "Good. Fear is cheap currency." She said, "Don't let it consume you." I said, "I won't. I'll watch." She said, "Watching is safer for now." I stared out at the city again. I said, "Everything I wanted is here, yet here I am still small." Ms. Liu said, "You're observing your power, not abusing it." I said, "Am I good or bad?" She said, "You decide daily." I said, "Feels like 1,000 days in one." She laughed. Emily called again. I ignored it. I said, "She cracks faster than I thought." My stomach tightened. I said, "Do I care?" I sipped coffee. I said, "No, but I notice." She left a voicemail. I said, "Pathetic attempt at control." I didn't delete it. I said, "Evidence of weakness is useful." Ms. Liu looked at me. She said, "You're calmer." I said, "Or numb." She said, "Control masks pain, but don't mistake it for peace." I said, "I don't need peace. I need options." She said, "Options can be deadly." I said, "Then I choose carefully." I wandered the apartment. I said, "High ceilings, low soul." I touched the balcony glass. I said, "I could jump, but that changes nothing." Ms. Liu said over the phone, "Your grandfather left you power, not comfort." I said, "Then comfort is for fools." She laughed softly. I said, "And yet I feel foolish anyway." I checked my emails. Ryan's name popped up. I said, "Banking irregularities flagged." Ms. Liu said, "Internal audit picked up your hints." I said, "He panicked." She said, "He's sloppy under pressure." I said, "Sloppy is the word." She said, "Do you want me to confront him?" I said, "Not yet. Let fear stew." I walked to the kitchen. I said, "Emily might think she matters still." I looked out the window. I said, "She's losing her edge." Ms. Liu said, "Observation is a weapon if wielded wisely." I said, "Then I watched silently." The city hummed below. I said, "Every light a life, every shadow a secret." Ms. Liu said, "You feel it too much." I said, "Or not enough." She said, "Balance is hard." I said, "Balance is overdone. I'll tip it my way." I remembered the bus bench. I said, "From nothing to this strange trajectory." Ms. Liu said, "You survived because you adapt." I said, "I survived because I have nothing to lose." She said, "And now you have everything to manage." I laughed dryly. I said, "Management isn't comfort." I checked the phone again. Emily texted, "Please talk." I said, "Talk?" We already spoke through betrayal. I ignored her. I said, "Not today, not ever." Ms. Liu said, "Her confidence falters, notice that." I said, "I notice. I don't act." She said, "Good. Power is patience first." I sat on the couch. I said, "Money is nothing without morals." Ms. Liu said, "True. But people will mistake wealth for wisdom." I said, "Then let them." I stretched my hands toward the window. I said, "Everything I thought I wanted is here. Still doesn't fill the void." She said, "That void keeps you human." I said, "Human enough to choose." I glanced at my reflection in the glass. I said, "I am watching myself too." I said again, "I am learning who I want to become." The city lights blinked. I said, "Tonight, I am powerful. Tomorrow, I decide." Ms. Liu said, "Tomorrow will require courage." I said, "I have courage. Quiet, slow, observant." She said, "Good. That is enough for now." I nodded. I said, "I am enough for now." I whispered, "At least I am awake." I touched the cold glass and said, "I see everything clearly." The wind outside rattled the balcony door. I said, "Let the night come. I am ready." I watched the news from my apartment. I said, "Ryan's empire is wobbling." Ms. Lu appeared behind me. She said, "Investors are pulling out." I said, "Finally." She said, "He suspects nothing." I laughed softly. I said, "Ignorance is a gift I didn't give him." My phone buzzed. "Emily." I didn't answer. I said, "Not today." Ms. Lu said, "She's desperate." I said, "Good. Let her feel the weight of her choice." Hours later, she appeared outside the lobby. I said, "You look tired." She said, I need to see you." I said, "You should have thought of that 3 years ago." She said, "I made mistakes." I said, "You made a betrayal." She swallowed hard. I said, "Not small mistakes, Emily. The kind that ruins people." She said, "I know. I'm sorry." I said, "Sorry isn't enough." She stepped closer. I said, "Don't." She said, "Please, just talk." I said, "Talk? We've already talked in lies." Her eyes wavered. I said, "Do you realize how long I carried silence?" She said, "I know now." I said, "You're late to regret." She said, I didn't think." I cut her off. I said, "You chose him over me." She trembled. I said, "Every lie you told, every secret you kept, I swallowed." She looked down. I said, "You think silence is forgiveness?" She shook her head. I said, "No. Silence is my survival." She said, I wanted security." I said, "You wanted him, not me." She whispered, "It wasn't just him." I said, "I don't care. You broke me anyway." She winced. I said, "Do you even hear yourself?" She said, "I hear it." I said, "Not enough." She reached out. I said, "Don't touch me." She said, "Please, I regret it." I said, "Regret isn't my hand to hold." Her lips trembled. I said, "I won't yell. I won't scream." She blinked. I said, "But I will never forget." She said, "I thought you'd forgive." I said, "Forgive? You confused loyalty for weakness." She said, I thought we." I said, "We ended when you chose him." She sobbed quietly. I said, "I didn't need a sound. I needed honesty." She said, "I was scared." I said, "Fear doesn't excuse theft of heart and trust." We stood in silence. I said, "You're afraid now. That's fair." She said, "I never wanted this." I said, "No, you wanted him." She stared at the ground. I said, "See what your choices cost." She said nothing. I said, "I carried you through my mind for years. Every betrayal, I replayed silently." She shivered. I said, "I won't replay anymore." Her voice cracked. She said, I don't know how to fix it." I said, "You can't. That door closed." She said, "Please." I said, "I'm done listening to excuses." Her face paled. I said, "I walk away, not because I forgive you. Because you don't have power over me anymore." She whispered, "You'll hate me forever." I said, "I already stopped caring about you." She stepped back. I said, "Look at me. You wanted fear, but I don't scare anymore." She trembled. I said, "See? You're small now. That's what betrayal costs." She said nothing. I said, "Goodbye, Emily." I turned away. I felt the weight lift. I said, "That's enough poison for one lifetime." I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button. I said, "Step carefully. Comma walk slowly but surely." The ride down was quiet. I said, "Ryan doesn't see it coming either." My phone buzzed. I ignored it. I said, "Let him call. Let him worry." Ms. Lu's words echoed in my head. She said, "Slow payback hurts the most." I said, "I like it slow." I stepped onto the street. I said, he's sweating already. Cars honked. I said, the city doesn't care. That's perfect. A man walked past, laughing. I said, keep laughing. Keep blind. My hand touched my pocket. I felt the card. I said, you saved me, old friend. Later, I watched the news again. Ryan stumbled in interviews. I said, look at him unravel. Ms. Lu said, panic is obvious. I said, he never learns humility. She said, he will now, quietly. I smiled faintly. I said, quiet justice is satisfying. Emily texted again. I didn't answer. I said, her fear is enough. I won't add. I walked through the lobby. I said, freedom feels strange without anger. Ms. Lu called. She said, well done staying composed. I said, composed isn't happy. Just free. I looked at the sky above skyscrapers. I said, power doesn't heal, but it reveals. Ms. Lu said, you've learned something. I said, I see my choices clearly. She said, and your enemies? I said, they fall because of their own hands. Not mine. I leaned on the railing. I said, nothing left to chase here except truth. The wind whipped past. I said, calmer whispers. I listened quietly. I took a deep breath. I said, I am watching, learning, surviving. Ms. Lu said, exactly. I said, slowly. Every day. She said, and you will see the end. I nodded. I said, I already see enough to move on. Emily's shadow lingered in my mind. I said, not mine anymore. Ryan's mistakes multiplied. I said, not mine either. The city hummed, indifferent. I said, perfect timing for them both. I took the first step down the street. I said, I'm ready to walk forward. I woke to the sound of sirens in the distance. I said, not my city, not my problem. The TV flickered on automatically. I said, news at dawn, perfect timing. Ryan's face filled the screen. I said, he looks nervous. The reporter said, breaking, Ryan Clark taken into custody. I laughed softly. I said, finally, the puppet cuts his own strings. The camera showed him struggling with officers. I said, pathetic. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. I said, who is this? Ryan said, please. I need you. I said, you have my full attention now. He said, I can explain. I said, explain what? That envy killed your sense. He said, I made mistakes. I said, mistakes? You destroyed trust, money, lives. He said, I never wanted. I said, stop. Don't excuse it. He stuttered. I said, do you hear how small you sound? He said, I panicked. I said, panic isn't new. You just hid behind lies. He said, I was jealous. I said, jealousy isn't crime, it's your weapon. You chose it poorly. He said, I thought I could beat you. I said, beat me? You never understood me. He whispered, I wanted everything. I said, you had greed, not vision. He begged. I said, Ryan, I won't help. I won't destroy. I just watch. He shouted, I can't survive without you. I said, that's the truth finally spilling. You can't. Not ever. He gasped. I said, you built a world of lies. Let it crumble. He said nothing. I said, I stepped aside years ago. Now reality does the work. Silence. I hung up. I said, power isn't in saving. It's in letting go. I poured coffee. I said, no revenge, no rush, just freedom. The news repeated footage of him being led into the van. I said, pathetic hero complex shattered. Ms. Lu called. She said, he's finally being questioned. I said, I'm not celebrating, just observing. She said, wise. Let karma speak quietly. I said, it's cruel and it's fair. She said, exactly. Later, Sam appeared on my balcony. I said, "You again?" He laughed. He said, "Someone has to remind you where you started." I said, "From a bench, wet and ignored." He nodded. He said, "Not so small now, huh?" I said, "Not so small. Still human." He smiled. He said, "Good. Never forget that." I said, "I still remember nights on the street." He said, "Then you'll know what to do with kindness." I said, "I can arrange help. Anonymously." He said, "No strings." I said, "No strings. Just survive." He said, "I'll remember." I said, "Then don't forget who you are." He laughed. He said, "Still a mentor, huh?" I said, "Not exactly. Just someone who learned patience." The city lights glittered below. I said, "Ryan's empire crumbles. Emily's cornered. I walk free." Sam said, "Freedom isn't peace. Don't forget that." I said, "I won't. But I won't carry anger either." He said, "That's rare." I said, "It's necessary." Emily called. I ignored it. I said, "Her fear is mine no longer." Sam said, "Smart. Weakness follows power only if you let it." I said, "I choose differently." I poured another cup of coffee. I said, "I've been angry for years." I said, "Now I'm quiet." Sam said, "Quiet can be louder than screams." I said, "It's truth in control, not chaos." The phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. I said, "Who is it?" It was Ryan. He whispered, "Please, help me." I said, "I can't. And I won't." He shouted, "I'm lost without you." I said calmly, "Good. Now you feel what your actions taught others." He went silent. I said, "Exactly." I hung up. I said, "Not my battle anymore. The truth finishes the fight." Sam leaned against the balcony railing. He said, "You're colder than I expected." I said, "Not cold. Detached." He said, "Detached saves you from drowning in their mistakes." I said, "And from myself." He nodded. He said, "Then you're ready." I said, "Ready to live without chains." I looked at my reflection in the glass. I said, "From the bench to here. Who knew?" Sam said, "You did." Slowly, quietly, painfully. I said, "Pain teaches better than victory ever could." He laughed. He said, "Wise kid." The phone buzzed again. I ignored it. I said, "Every call doesn't deserve a response." Sam said, "Even if it's temptation?" I said, "Especially then." He said, "Good. Keep walking that way." I stared at Ryan on the news again. I said, "He's small, scared, and alone." Sam said, "He planted that seed himself." I said, "And I step aside, letting it grow." He nodded. He said, "Let life do its work." Emily's name popped up again. I ignored it. I said, "Fear can't touch me anymore." Sam said, "Power without hate feels strange, huh?" I said, "Strange but right." I leaned back in the chair. I said, "Years of anger, months of planning, gone in a quiet moment." Sam said, "Not gone. Transformed." I said, "Transformed into freedom." He said, "Exactly." The sun set behind skyscrapers. I said, "Ryan's world collapses. Emily fears. I move forward." Sam said, "You earned this calm." I said, "I didn't earn it. I let it come." He smiled. He said, "Patience pays more than revenge." I said, "I see that now." I touched my grandfather's card. I said, "This started there. And here I am." Sam said, "The circle completes quietly." I said, "Quiet is good." I said again, "I'm free." The city hummed. I said, "No anger, no fear, just steps forward." Sam said, "And never forget the streets." I said, "I won't. They shaped me." I stood. I said, "Freedom tastes strange but real." Sam said, "Walk it fully." I nodded. I said, "I will." I watched Ryan's image disappear from the news. I said, "Not my hand. Not my wrath. The truth handles him." Sam said, "Exactly." I said, "I'm finally done with them." I whispered, "Done with the past." I walked down the empty street. I said, "Power revealed, pain dissolved, freedom claimed." Sam nodded silently. I said, "I step forward." The wind carried no threats. I said, "Only life." I looked at the sky. I said, "And I am ready." I parked at the cemetery and stepped out. I said, "Here we are, Arthur." The wind whispered through the trees. I said, "I finally get it." I knelt beside the gravestone. I said, "You wanted me strong. Not rich, not ruthless, just strong." A crow cawed. I said, "Funny how it took losing everything to see that." I touched the stone. I said, "I hated the streets, hated being small, hated Emily and Ryan." I paused. I said, "I don't hate anymore." I held the old black card in my hand. I said, "All this power, all this money, none of it mattered until I understood you." I smiled faintly. I said, "Strength isn't about revenge. It's restraint." I imagined Grandpa's voice. He said, "Control yourself, not others." I said aloud, "I finally do." I laughed quietly. I said, "It feels lighter than I thought it would." I looked at the horizon. I said, "Ryan crumbles, Emily fears, and I'm free." I pressed the card to my chest. I said, "Not as a weapon, Arthur, as a reminder." A small breeze stirred. I said, "I'll build, not destroy. Invest in people, not egos." I pictured Sam, clean and smiling somewhere safe. I said, "He'll have help. Quiet. Anonymous. Just like you taught me to give." I sat on the grass. I said, "No more anger, no more waiting for justice." I touched the cold ground. I said, "Everything I chased outside, it was inside me all along." I whispered, "I am steady now. Not rich, not broken, just me." I thought about Emily's trembling voice, Ryan's panic. I said, "They got consequences, I got lessons. Perfect balance." I held the card tighter. I said, "I'll use this wisely. Not for fear, not for leverage, only for purpose." I traced its edges. I said, "The streets, the pain, they made this worth understanding." I leaned back, letting the sun warm my face. I said, "Grandpa, I'm finally honest with you." I said, "I'll do good with what I've inherited. Not ruin anyone." I imagined the faces of those I helped along the way. I said, "People matter more than money, more than revenge, more than pride." The breeze tugged at my hair. I said, "I am steady, finally steady." I stood, brushing off grass. I said, "Power is quiet now. I'll wield it like restraint, not anger." I looked at the grave. I said, "Thank you for the lesson." I walked slowly to the car. I said, "The world will see wealth, yes. But I see myself. And I am calm." The card stayed in my pocket. I said, "It's a tool, a memory, a promise. Not a weapon." I passed Sam's bench on the way home. I said, "He's safe. I've arranged it. No thanks, no recognition, just right." The wind carried faint laughter from nowhere. I said, "He would have laughed at this too." I entered my apartment. I said, "Finally, a home that isn't just walls, a home that feels mine." I poured coffee. I said, "No bitterness, no anger, just purpose." I picked up the card again. I said, "Remember this, Daniel. Power without rage is strength." I looked at the skyline through the window. I said, "Money isn't the lesson. People are." I sat, letting the weight of the day settle. I said, "Ryan's downfall is not mine. Emily's fear is not mine. Only my calm, only my choice, only my freedom is mine." I smiled faintly. I said, "I am finally steady. No ghosts chasing me. No chains." The city hummed outside. I whispered, "Arthur, I hope I make you proud. I pressed the card to my chest one last time. I said, power is quiet. Life is quiet. And I am steady. I poured another cup of coffee. I said, tomorrow will come. But today I just breathe. I stood by the window, looking down at streets that no longer frighten me. I said, I am free. I am calm. I am enough. The sun dipped behind the towers. I said, everything I lost led me here. Not to wealth, not to revenge, but to peace. I sat again, coffee in hand, card in pocket, and whispered, I am finally steady. The breeze whispered back through the open window. I said, and I will keep walking forward, always forward, calmly, quietly, with purpose. I looked at the card one last time. I said, thank you for guiding me, Grandpa. I finally understand. I set it down gently on the desk. I said, not as a weapon, as a reminder. And I will never forget. I leaned back in my chair, letting the calm sink in fully. I said, I am rich enough to let go. I closed my eyes. I said, I am steady.